They treated him like just another random stop-and-frisk target. Then he pulled out his phone, called his daughter, and turned their whole world upside down. Charles Jefferson never expected trouble that day. At 72, he had lived through enough history to know how the world worked, but he had also earned the right to enjoy his routines. Every afternoon, like clockwork, he strolled 2 blocks down to Joe's Coffee on Lincoln Avenue in St. Louis, a place where the barista, a college kid named Ryan, already knew his order. A small black coffee, no sugar, a corner seat by the window, where he could watch the world move at its usual pace. Charles liked the familiarity, the hum of conversation, the scent of roasted beans, the sound of chairs scraping against the wooden floor. He would read the newspaper, front to back, fold it neatly, and head home before the Missouri heat became unbearable. It was his time, his small slice of peace, but peace is a fragile thing. As he stepped out of the cafe, coffee in one hand, newspaper tucked under his arm, he heard the low rumble of an approaching engine. A black and white squad car rolled to a slow stop a few feet ahead of him. The driver's window was down, and for a moment, Charles considered whether to keep walking. Maybe they weren't here for him. Then the doors opened. 2 officers stepped out. One was young, barely in his 20s, with a buzz cut and a stiff posture. The other was older, probably mid-40s, with the kind of build that suggested he enjoyed throwing his weight around. Neither of them looked particularly friendly. "Sir, can we see some ID?" the younger one asked, voice flat, rehearsed. Charles stopped, blinking at them. His heart didn't race. It didn't need to. He had been through this before, too many times to count. His father had warned him about moments like these. So had his grandfather. He tilted his head slightly. "Is there a problem, officers?" The older cop shifted, placing a hand on his belt. "We got a call about a suspicious person matching your description." Charles glanced around. The sidewalk wasn't crowded, but there were enough people to witness what was happening. A woman pushing a stroller slowed her steps. A man on a bike turned his head. He let out a slow breath. Suspicious? He looked down at himself. Khaki slacks, a crisp button-up, a neatly trimmed grey beard, a newspaper and a coffee in hand. "You sure about that?" The younger officer squared his shoulders. "We just need to check your ID. Standard procedure." Charles had 2 choices: comply and walk away, or stand his ground. He was tired of this dance, but he wasn't a fool. So he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. But the moment his fingers brushed against the leather, the older cop stepped forward. "Hands on the car." Charles froze. The street noise dulled. He could feel the shift. This wasn't just about ID anymore, but he wasn't going to let them push him around. Before Charles could hand over his ID, the older officer grabbed his wrist, his grip rougher than necessary. "Turn around. Hands on the car," he ordered, his tone no longer carrying the pretense of civility. Charles's body stiffened. He had seen this play out before, on the news, in stories passed down through generations, in moments that ended in tragedy. His chest tightened, but he kept his voice even. "I'm a 72-year-old man walking home from a coffee shop. What exactly am I being detained for?" The younger officer hesitated, eyes flickering toward his partner. He seemed uncertain now, but the older cop doubled down. "You fit the description," he repeated, as if that was supposed to explain everything. Charles could feel the eyes of onlookers. A young black man with earbuds had stopped mid-step, his phone held low, angled just enough to record. A middle-aged woman in scrubs lingered by her car, watching closely. Someone else, he couldn't see who, was already holding up their phone. He let out a slow breath, keeping his hands where they could see them. "I don't resist. I don't fight. I don't run." That's what he had told his daughter when she was younger. That's what his own father had told him. But none of that mattered. The older cop reached forward, patting him down roughly, his hands pressing into Charles's pockets, over his chest, down his sides. Charles clenched his jaw as a deep frustration settled in his bones. Humiliation wasn't new, but it never got easier. "You have any weapons?" the younger cop asked, still standing slightly behind his partner. Charles scoffed. "Do I look like I have a weapon?" He turned his head slightly, meeting the younger officer's eyes. "Do you even know why you're doing this?" The young cop shifted uncomfortably, but the older one remained firm. "Just checking. Cooperate, and you'll be on your way." A lie. Charles had seen this go too far before. He thought of names, too many to count, of men who had complied but still ended up with knees on their necks. Or worse. He exhaled slowly. Then, carefully, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The older cop reacted instantly. "Hands where I can see them." Charles held the phone up, not making any sudden movements. "I'm calling my daughter." The younger officer's brow furrowed. "Sir, just—" Charles pressed the number he knew by heart. 1 ring. 2 rings. Then she answered. "Hey, Dad, what's wrong?" Her voice was sharp, focused. Charles finally allowed himself a small breath of relief. She always knew when something wasn't right. The older cop frowned. "Who's he calling?" Charles locked eyes with him, then said clearly, "My daughter, the U.S. Attorney General." And just like that, everything changed. Silence. For the first time since the officers stepped out of their car, they hesitated. The older cop's expression flickered, just for a second, before his jaw tightened. The younger officer, who had been following his partner's lead, suddenly looked less sure of himself. Charles held the phone steady. His daughter's voice came through the speaker, clear and unwavering. "Dad, where are you?" He didn't take his eyes off the officers. Lincoln Avenue, just outside Joe's Coffee. A brief pause. Charles could picture her face, the way her brows would draw together, the way her sharp mind would already be assembling the next steps. Then her tone changed. Cool, controlled, dangerous. "Put me on speaker." Charles didn't hesitate. He turned the volume up and held the phone out between them. "This is Monica Jefferson, U.S. Attorney General," she said, her voice slicing through the air like a blade. "Who am I speaking to?" The younger officer's spine stiffened. He took an instinctive step back, glancing at his partner, who still had one hand hovering near his belt. The older cop was slower to react, but Charles saw the way his fingers twitched. He knew they were in trouble. "Ma'am?" The older officer started, his voice suddenly more measured. "This is—" "I don't care who you are," Monica cut in. "You are currently detaining my father, a 72-year-old man, without cause. I expect a clear and immediate explanation." The crowd had grown. More phones were recording now. A woman in a navy blazer whispered to someone beside her. A teenager stood near the curb, eyes flickering between the officers and the phone in Charles's hand. The older cop licked his lips. "We received a call about a suspicious person." What was suspicious about him? Monica's voice held no room for hesitation. Was he committing a crime? Was he a threat? The younger officer shifted on his feet. Answer me." Silence stretched. The older officer finally swallowed, his face hardening. "It was a misunderstanding." Monica exhaled sharply through the speaker. Charles could hear her barely contained frustration. "A misunderstanding? That's what you're calling it?" The younger officer, clearly rattled now, looked to his partner. He was waiting for instruction, for something to diffuse the situation. But the older cop had nothing left to say. Charles adjusted the phone in his hand. "Liv, what do you want me to do? Are you free to go?" she asked. Neither officer answered. Charles turned his attention back to them. "Well, am I?" The older cop's jaw clenched. Then with clear reluctance he took a step back. The younger officer nodded quickly, his hand falling away from his belt. "Yes, sir. You're free to go." Charles didn't move right away. He let the moment sink in, let the weight of the scene settle around them like a closing argument in court. Then he gave the officers one last look and lifted the phone to his ear. "You still there, Liv?" Her voice was steady. "Still here, Dad." He allowed himself the smallest of smiles. "Guess I'll see you for dinner." And just like that, he walked away. But the world wasn't done watching. Charles took slow, measured steps, his back straight, his head high. He wasn't hurrying. He wasn't running. He was leaving on his own terms. Behind him, the silence stretched. The officers, once so sure of themselves, stood frozen. The older one's fists clenched at his sides, frustration radiating from every stiff movement. The younger one looked down, eyes darting toward the bystanders whose phones were still recording. He knew what was happening. He knew this moment wasn't staying on Lincoln Avenue. It was heading straight for the world. But Charles wasn't done just yet. He stopped, turned back slowly, phone still in hand. "I hope you boys learned something today," he said, his voice calm, even. "Because a lot of people are about to learn about you." The older officer bristled. "Sir, we were just—" "No," Charles interrupted, shaking his head. "No excuses. You knew what you were doing." He glanced at the crowd. "And so does everyone else." A woman in scrubs, someone who had been watching the whole time, spoke up. "This how you treat all your suspicious persons?" A man in a mechanic's uniform let out a dry chuckle. "They thought they could rough up some old guy. Didn't expect him to have the right connections, huh?" The older cop turned toward the crowd, his face darkening. But the younger one nudged his elbow, shaking his head slightly. They were in too deep now. There was no way to undo what had already been done. Charles lifted the phone back to his ear. "You still there, Monica?" Her voice came through, sharp and steady. "I'm here, Dad." He nodded, speaking loud enough for the officers to hear. "I think these officers are realizing they might need a new job soon." The older cop's jaw clenched. The younger officer swallowed hard. A moment later, a new sound cut through the tension. The static of a police radio in the squad car. Another voice, distant but clear. "Unit 47. What's your status?" The officers hesitated. The older one's lips parted, as if he wanted to say something, anything, to regain control of the moment. But there was no taking back the last 10 minutes. Charles exhaled slowly and put his phone back in his pocket. "You have a good day now, officers." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. But he knew this was only the beginning. Charles didn't look back. He didn't need to. The shift in power had already happened. The officers weren't chasing him down. They weren't barking orders anymore. They stood frozen in the weight of their own failure. The tension in the air was thick as the crowd remained, watching, recording. The moment wasn't lost on them. This wasn't just about Charles anymore. It was about every man who had ever been stopped for walking while black, every father who had told his children how to stay safe, every story that had ended in a way this one nearly had. A woman in a navy blazer stepped forward, phone still pointed at the officers. "Badge numbers?" she asked, voice sharp. The younger officer's mouth opened, then closed. His partner, still clinging to whatever authority he thought he had left, squared his shoulders. "Ma'am, you need to step back." The woman arched a brow. "Or what?" She motioned to the crowd around her. "We all saw what happened. You really want to dig a deeper hole?" The older cop glared but said nothing. The younger one, now visibly uncomfortable, cleared his throat. "It's all just a misunderstanding." A laugh rippled through the crowd. A mechanic leaned against a lamppost, arms crossed. "Yeah, funny how those misunderstandings always seem to happen to the same kind of folks." The officers were losing ground and they knew it. Meanwhile, Charles continued walking, his pace steady, his head high. He had won today. But victory wasn't the same as justice. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. "Monica," he answered. "Still watching?" Her voice was quieter now, but just as firm. "The video's already online, Dad." He wasn't surprised. "How bad is it?" "Bad for them." A pause. "People are angry." "It's spreading fast." Charles nodded to himself. He had been in this world long enough to know that some things didn't change unless they were forced to. "They're going to issue a statement," Monica continued. "Expect words like review and procedural evaluation. But no apology. Of course not." Charles let out a slow breath. "What happens now?" A pause. Then Monica said what he already knew. "We keep watching." And Charles, standing in the middle of Lincoln Avenue, looking out at a world that had seen one more truth it couldn't ignore, nodded, because this wasn't just about him anymore. By the time Charles got home, his legs were sore, but his mind was still racing. He had been through a lot in his 72 years, but today felt different. He wasn't just another black man stopped for no reason. This time the world had been watching, and it wasn't looking away. He eased into his favorite chair, the one near the window where he could see the street outside. The neighborhood looked the same, but everything felt charged, like the air before a storm. He turned on the TV, and there it was. His own face, frozen mid-walk, captured from shaky cell phone footage. Breaking news. St. Louis police stop elderly man without cause. His daughter, the U.S. Attorney General, intervenes. The news anchors were already dissecting it. Clips of the officers, the crowd, the moment they realized who they had messed with. Panelists debated whether the officers should be fired, whether new policies were needed. whether this was just another case of racial profiling that would soon be forgotten. His phone buzzed non-stop. Messages from old friends, former students, even strangers who had somehow found his number. Some were angry, others just wanted to tell him they stood with him. And then, the official statement from the St. Louis Police Department flashed across the screen. "We are aware of an incident involving 2 officers and an individual who was detained during a routine call. The department is currently conducting an internal review to ensure that all procedures were followed correctly. We take these matters seriously and remain committed to fair and just policing." Charles scoffed. Same song, different verse. The phone rang. "Monica." "Hey, Liv," he answered, using her childhood nickname. She sighed. "They're trying to contain it, Dad, but it's too late." He leaned back, watching the news replay the clip from different angles. "You think they'll actually do anything?" A pause. Then, not willingly, that was the truth. They'd rather let the outrage burn itself out. Let the news cycle move on, let another headline take its place. But this time, something felt different. The video was everywhere. It wasn't just being debated on news panels. It was being shared on social media by millions of people, from young activists to celebrities to everyday folks who had seen too much of this and had had enough. Monica's voice softened. "You okay?" Charles exhaled slowly, his fingers drumming against the arm of his chair. "I'm tired, Liv." "I know." They sat in silence for a moment, both of them listening to the distant voices on the television. Then Monica spoke again. "This isn't over." Charles glanced out the window, watching as a news van parked down the block, reporters stepping out, cameras in hand. "No," he said quietly. "It's just getting started." Charles watched from his window as the news crew set up down the block. The world had seen what happened, and now it was demanding answers. The officers might have let him go, but the damage was already done, the kind that doesn't just fade overnight. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from an old friend, a retired professor he hadn't spoken to in a while. "Proud of you. This needed to happen." Charles stared at the message for a long moment. He wasn't sure if proud was the right word. He hadn't set out to make a statement. He just wanted to get home. The knock at the door was soft, but certain. He already knew who it was before he opened it. Monica stood there, her arms crossed, looking him over like she was checking for hidden wounds. She had flown in. Of course she had. "You didn't have to come," he said, stepping aside to let her in. She gave him a look. "You know I did." They sat in the living room, the TV murmuring in the background. A news anchor was breaking down the incident, listing off statistics on racial profiling, showing clips of protests that had sparked overnight. The world was moving fast now, and Charles was caught in the current. Monica sighed, rubbing her temple. "They're going to spin this, Dad. The department will do their internal review, maybe suspend the officers with pay, and hope people forget by next week." He nodded. "I know how this works." "Then you know we can't let them move on that easily." He studied her. His daughter, the U.S. Attorney General, the woman who had spent her life fighting battles just like this. She had power, influence, and she was ready to use it. But Charles, an old man who had lived long enough to see history repeat itself more times than he could count, knew that power alone wasn't enough. The people had to care. He turned back to the window, watching as more neighbors gathered outside, some speaking to the reporters, some just standing there, holding their phones, watching, waiting. A slow smile tugged at his lips. "They won't forget," he said finally. "Not this time." Monica leaned back, watching him. "You really believe that?" Charles met her eyes. "I do." She exhaled, then nodded. "Then let's make sure of it." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You were always the stubborn one. You raised me that way." The phone buzzed again. More messages, more people reaching out, more voices refusing to let this moment slip away. Charles looked at his daughter, then at the screen, then at the world outside his window. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It never had been. He leaned forward, grabbed his coffee cup, and took a slow sip. Then with a calm certainty, he said, "Let's get to work. If stories like this matter to you, don't just watch. Stay aware, stay engaged, and stay vocal. Hit that subscribe button, share this story, and make sure the world keeps paying attention. Because change only happens when people refuse to look away."